Hello, I'm Ronnie Eldridge. Welcome to Eldridge & Company. With Japan's nuclear catastrophe, last year's Gulf oil spill, and tragic mine explosions in the recent past, it's no surprise that we're all asking if there really is any safe source of energy. Jim Larocca is the commissioner of the New York State Public Service Commission, and energy is his business, so I'm anxious to hear what he has to say. So, is there any real safe energy, do you think? Source of energy?
This is a little bit facile, but the safest source of energy is the energy you don't use.
Right. Oh, good.
So conservation
is the best.
In a very extravagant society like ours is the nearest, quickest, cheapest alternative for many of the daily ways we use energy.
Well, do you think we're ever going to be able to get to the public that all these crises and everything, that they really provide an answer?
Well,
we have such voracious appetites, don't we?
Yeah,
for
culturally,
everything.
we only do what we want to do, and we don't want to curtail our appetites in any way.
Yeah.
The very onset of the flat screen television, for example, had a bigger effect on energy consumption, electric energy in the home, than almost anything else since air conditioning. And air conditioning, who do you know that wants to live without air conditioning?
Right.
So we make choices all the time, and we hooted at Jimmy Carter, but Jimmy Carter had actually a pretty solid idea, which was the dollar saved is 100 cents on the dollar. Yeah. And so you can start there with a real examination of, are we doing enough to make better use of the energy that we have? And the answer is we're not. The state of New York, under a succession of governors, has now put back in place a number of the kind of programs that can reduce consumption in a way that people will go along with, which means that it doesn't involve a lot of sacrifice. But absent that, you're back in the conventional discussion of nuclear, coal, gas, what combination works for us.
It seems every category has something wrong with it. Let's start with nuclear, because that seems to be the most fearful of them all. I mean, we have a discussion now with Indian Point, our own nuclear reactor, close by. People are challenging it on the evacuation plan, but is that really the basic? I mean, I've never taken seriously signs that I see evacuation route. I mean, you can't get home at night if you're driving home. How are you going to evacuate? It's just, it's crazy.
Well, they used to make the observation that when Shoreham, the nuclear plant proposed for Long Island,
which never opened,
the evacuation plan there was tested once a week in the summer on Sunday afternoon when everybody tried to leave Long Island.
Exactly.
And of course it didn't work. One of the things I'm proudest of, going all the way back to my time in the Kerry administration, is killing 6 nuclear power plants that were proposed for the state of New York. 2 on the North Fork of Long Island, 1 in the Hudson Valley, and others upstate. And our reason, and Governor Kerry was very strong on this, was that nobody knew what was going to happen to the nuclear wastes. The plan then was the nuclear fuel is in the reactor, it's used, it comes out, it has to cool down for a couple of thousand years. You put it in a spent fuel pool until it can go to a repository. The federal government, 30 or 40 years ago, started collecting money from nuclear companies, ratepayers, to build a spent fuel storage facility somewhere in the country.
And they still haven't.
$30 billion later, 30 years later, every reactor in New York is at or near capacity for spent fuel. And the spent fuel is stored right next to the reactors. What we're learning now in Japan is the first problems with these reactors from the tsunami and the earthquake weren't with the reactors, was with the spent fuel pool. That was where the first escapes and the first loss of control. So one of the things that is as fresh as an issue in New York today as it was 40 years ago is we still don't know where the spent fuel is going. It's piling up right next to the reactors, including at Indian Point, and that's a question that has to be very seriously re-examined. And the president has said he wanted to try to bring nuclear power back because it does have advantages in terms of environmental pollution and so forth, but you can't do it till you solve the waste problem, and we are no closer to solving the waste problem than we were 2 generations ago.
Yucca Mountain, was that the famous site?
And the president very recently decided Yucca Mountain is not going to be the site. I think some of the attorney generals, and maybe New York is part of that, are looking to get some of that money back. We gave you over, New York, I think, spent $1.2 billion or $1.4 billion into this program, and we can't send them any
But
fuel.
not only that, the whole plant is old, isn't it?
Well, they are.
What is the lifespan considered for a nuclear reactor?
It varies reactor to reactor, and the NRC makes a judgment about that when they're put in place. Then, in many cases, there's a process for updating and extending the design life. But as you get to 20, 25, 30, 40 years, which is what's happening in Japan and is the case with some of the reactors in New York, the NRC, the federal primary jurisdiction, has to examine whether the upgrades and updates are sufficient for really extending the design life. I don't have an opinion about that, except that I know it's a very serious question, and I don't think it's being addressed in any systematic way.
The New York State basically has no control over it, does it?
Well, we have,
I mean, we can't say close it.
well, the Department of Environmental Conservation has an important voice in these matters, the state, because of the cooling issues and the water use, for example, at Indian Point, where the cooling water comes from the Hudson River. So we have roles, but the primary jurisdiction, going all the way back, I guess, right around Truman and Eisenhower, was that commercial nuclear power would be regulated nationally, first by the Atomic Energy Commission and later by the NRC, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, and that's still the case.
Yeah. So there are what, over 100 nuclear reactors in the country?
104.
4. And a good proportion of them are old.
Well, we haven't built any in 30 years, so one might argue that
I
they're
see.
all
Old.
old. Well,
Oh, that's interesting. All right, so we know that we have problems. They're fearful problems. I mean, they may not happen all the time, but when they happen, it's total
the way I like to
catastrophe.
think of it, and I think it's a useful way for people to think about it, there is a very small chance of a very huge catastrophe when you're talking to nuclear power.
Yeah,
In petroleum, oil from wells to,
right.
there's a much larger chance of a smaller catastrophe until you get to the Gulf of Mexico, where we saw that there was a
lasting
pretty
impact
big
on it, yeah.
catastrophe. Coal, because of the isolation of the mines and everything else, each mine has a level of risk of a catastrophe, but it's generally contained in the mine. So in all of these things, there's some sort of a risk-benefit argument that can be made, but what happens with nuclear, because it's the most regulated and the most engineered of all the forms, nevertheless, the small problem there can be a very big problem, and that's what people are afraid of. And Japan sort of now brings that home to a lot of people.
Now, it seems to me that gas is increasingly being looked upon as maybe the major source of energy in the future, natural gas. And that has also stimulated much argument about its safety or impact on the environment and on people. It's fascinating to listen to it, right?
Well, all of these forms have an argument. Wind, renewable, a lot of people arguing about that. Solar.
What are they arguing about wind? That it's noisy and that it kills birds?
It's
Yes.
noisy, it kills birds, it takes up a lot of real estate, it affects the horizon. When I was chairman of LIPA, I came in, Long Island Power Authority, I killed the plant they wanted to build, the wind farm they wanted to put off Jones Beach, because I considered a legitimate consideration the landscape, the seascape in that case, where you were going to change the historic environment of the South Shore of Long Island. I didn't think it was necessary. I didn't think the numbers worked. So there's no foolproof in any of these. But natural gas, when we wrote the first energy master plan for the state, it was basically a go-gas plan.
I should tell people that you were the commissioner of the first Department of Energy in the state.
In New York State, yes.
Okay, go on.
And we wrote the first energy master plan. It's a pretty good plan. And what we said in that plan is no new nukes, go gas, because between domestic and North American sources, other North American sources of natural gas, we had a almost clean version of fossil energy. Of course, it meant pipelines and risk and all of that, but the U.S. and New York in particular have made great gains in natural gas. Most of the power plants, the oil plants around New York now, burn natural gas. You don't see those dirty plumes anymore that you had when they were coal and oil-fired. So there's been a lot of progress with natural gas, but it is now interesting that one of the debates that's emerging is this so-called fracturing, in the Marcellus Shale, which is the rock formations, the geological formations in a lot of New York and over into Pennsylvania, which is where gas first started coming from and where J.D. Rockefeller made his first money. And how many years later?
But the issue is controversial all over. I mean, Texas is a big site of controversy. They call it fracking. That's the short term.
Right.
And let's just talk about what it means, because it's getting to be a big issue in New York, I think.
Yes. Imagine a rock formation that is not solid. It's porous. There are spaces. And over geologic time, these spaces fill with methane. And to liberate that methane, the practice is to drill a hole and to put pressure on the rock so it fractures. And as it fractures, the gas is liberated, gathered in a well, and brought to the surface and used. That's a practice that's been going on for many, many years. They use a combination of steam, air pressure, and certain chemicals.
Sand and water.
Sand and water. And all of that together fractures these formations. And what has changed from the historic practice is that the devices now for going into the ground can also then go sideways. And the complaint, with some documentation to it, is that they don't always know when they put this much pressure underground what's going to break and where the gas is going to be liberated. And you've seen these movies by now of people turning on their faucet and lighting the water and gas that comes out and so forth. So it's not a perfect solution to anything, and it'll be one of the real energy debates in New York. In fact, it is right now and will be the next couple of years.
It's seeping into the ground so that it's polluting. I mean, it's causing. It shows up in all different kinds of things as danger to people. It's not just the gas coming out of the faucet, but it's the...
Well, the gas getting into the groundwater is the primary worry, but anywhere it would come to the surface unregulated is a concern, because, you know, natural gas, when you use it at home, has a smell to it. That's added. Methane has no odor on its own. So if you have escape where it shouldn't be, you don't even necessarily know it.
When they draw the pictures, they have the drill going down and then it's horizontal. So does the gas come up the same thing that has been put down in the same pipes? It does.
Probably yes and no in the following sense. If you just think of a large rock formation and you fractured the whole thing, so a million little opportunities now that were capturing the gas are broken open, and the gas finds its way to the larger spaces. And the wells are meant then to draw the gas from those larger spaces. But one of the complaints that people have is that it sounds like an approximate science. It's not a detailed science. And once you start going horizontally, there are property issues. You might have started there, but now you're under my property. Or the economic one, if you're taking gas, but it's really from under here, I should be.
And it's especially interesting issue for New York City because we have unfiltered water, right? Don't we have unfiltered water?
Well, it's an issue in terms of New York's water supply comes essentially from the mountains north of us. Right.
So New York wants to have a mile, I guess, around each of the wells so that we don't get that seepage in enough to affect the ground and then finally the water, right?
It's a big debate. The water comes out of a watershed. Water is precipitated from the sky. It gathers in small streams. We, in many cases, New York City built reservoirs to hold it. Some of that's also used for power, dam control, flood control. There's a lot of uses of that water. And if you're now disturbing the geological formations under all of this in a way where you can't guarantee a result, then you have the debate that we have.
And one of the basic problems is once you get the water, the excess water, then you have to clean it, right? So that the drilling company or whoever's doing the project has to then have a plant, doesn't it, that has to filter it and clean it so that it goes back? No?
That is part of the advocacy,
right.
And it varies from place to place. If you're doing this in remote areas, the argument is you don't have to do the same kind of measures you would do when you're in the New York watershed or near the New York watershed. But that's why this debate is so intense and complicated, because it's partly old science and partly new science, and it's driven by a new set of concerns about other choices. And for the longest time, other sources were strong enough that this idea of fracturing new geological formations wasn't particularly attractive economically.
Right.
But now that
we
$140 a barrel oil changes everything.
Yeah. So one of the major problems, it seems to me, with energy all over is regulation. No?
Too much, too little.
Too little. No? Too little oversight. Too much of a combination of special interests into with the regulators. What are we ever going to do about that?
I'm not sure I would accept the premise. I hear, now that I sit on the Public Service Commission, and this is my 5th cabinet level job in New York associated with energy or transportation, I've never heard of anybody regulated who doesn't complain that there's too much regulation.
Of course they always
And I've never heard of advocates who don't like results who say the regulators aren't doing their job. So somewhere in that middle. The New York State Public Service Commission is a pretty vigorous organization. It's been around a very long time. It's been a model. 2 of our chairmen have become federal energy regulators. So I think New York has a pretty solid record. But we're in new territory, new economic pressures, new environmental pressure, and new environmental knowledge. We're learning a lot. We've learned a lot over time. And we really need to take this debate back over to the stuff we started talking about 30 years ago: renewables, solar, wind, all of those hippie or soft path energy forms, and make sense of those. You know, when you and I first knew each other, everybody we knew was getting smaller cars. Then everybody went to sleep, and then the SUV came on the scene, and they were all bigger and heavier than Cadillacs and all of the rest. But at the same time, the regulators in Washington put mileage standards on cars. Had an enormous effect. So sometimes regulation actually works. The automobile companies, left to their own devices, were not making cars more gas efficient. The regulation, the Congress, the president required it.
Now the federal government, federal regulations that are drafted, the environmental protection legislation, doesn't it provide a lot of exemptions in different places so people are able to, the manufacturers or whatever, what do we call them, the producers of the energy? I mean, it's always said that there are so many loopholes that they are able to go around and do all these things.
Nuclear power is heavily subsidized by federal taxpayers. Oil and gas is heavily subsidized by federal taxpayers. Coal, which is still the leading source of electric power, is regulated by the federal government and has all kinds of subsidies built into the tax codes and so forth. When the argument came to subsidies for solar, subsidies for conservation, much of the pushback was, well, you can't subsidize it. So we're very selective. But the fact is, we have, by public policy in the form of tax treatment, intruded in every energy form. What happened starting with Ronald Reagan, who tore up all of the Nixon, all of the Ford, all of the Carter energy stuff, is that all of that went out the window. When Ronald Reagan became president, less than 20% of all our oil was from foreign sources. When Bill Clinton left office, almost 70% was coming from overseas. I think it's a big part of the debate you and I are not going to have today about what's going on in the Middle East, because oil is still a big factor there.
Absolutely, let's talk about that. But before we do that, I wanted to ask you about South America, because it's more and more a producer of oil, and capacity is quite large, right? So don't you think it was important for us to have the president go down to South America and really to work with these governments?
Oh, sure.
And then
you know, Latin America is interested. If you look at the last 30 years, most of Latin America went from banana republic type dictatorships to actual democracies. Right. And there's a little pushback and a little too left for some people, but there's a lot more democracy than there was. Nobody remembers that OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, was formed in part by Venezuela. It's not just the Arab countries. Venezuela was a prime mover in that. Venezuela is a very important source of oil for this country. And we have this guy there now who nobody seems to like, and there's a lot of reasons not to like him, and but he is an energy supplier, just as we don't like a lot of the people in the Middle East, but we depend on their oil. What happens to us as a country is when we need your oil so desperately, or we need anything from you so desperately, all of our policy and other values get subordinated.
Right.
And that's a terrible national security mess to be in. And we have not really made an awful lot of progress.
And that's what we're faced with now, the challenge.
Absolutely.
Because all of these people are being challenged. And it's interesting because the president seems to be, well, he's caught in the middle, but he certainly started with Libya, didn't he? But you can't figure out why.
Well, I think Libya is an interesting problem, but the rationale for Libya may also carry to Bahrain, Yemen, Syria, and so forth.
But he seemed to imply in his speech, don't you think, that he was supporting the people?
Oh, it's couched in terms of humanitarian, national liberation, all of those things.
And other countries too, though.
Yeah, but it's
going to be a major change if that happens. And
I mean, how much of this can we do?
Yeah.
Secretary Gates sort of said, we're running short.
Right. So what do you think is going to happen in the Middle East?
I don't know. I'm very concerned about this Libya thing because we don't have a second act. We're doing a no-fly zone. Most people say air power alone is not enough to win a war on the ground. The president says we're not going to put any troops in there. Gates says he doesn't have the troops to put in. Others say it's inevitable. One thing leads to another. These things never go the way you want. But I asked the question, would we be there under these conditions, as we are in Iraq, for example, if there was no oil? Would we see it the same way?
Well, we've always said that we went into Iraq for the oil, didn't we?
No, we went there.
For the hidden.
And then there was Kuwait, and then because Saddam Hussein had something to do with 9/11, which it turns out he didn't, or he had nuclear weapons, which he didn't. And so the rationales get rolled out.
It's a very interesting thing to consider about what's happening in the Middle East, because we're all supporting, or a lot of us are supporting all the people against the regimes, but then we don't know what we're going to get. I mean, Egypt is fascinating to follow now, isn't it? It's still military control, although they're trying, I think there's a lot of distrust and dissatisfaction with it, so they're trying to eliminate it by today. I think they made some announcements today about major things, but we don't know who's going to emerge and what's going to happen, and then we certainly don't know what's going to happen with the oil. Huh?
It's very interesting historically that these apparently genuine, from the ground up revolutions came forward with this much strength without any natural leader, without any personality, without any focal point.
Yeah.
So when you have a revolution where everybody knows what they don't want, and then they succeed, what do we do now, boys? And I think that's what we're seeing in Egypt.
So what do you do with were the oil companies listed as contributors to Gaddafi?
Well, the interesting thing about all the reporting about this kickback stuff is that the companies haven't been named. But one has to assume anybody doing major business in a major corrupt environment like Libya, one way or the other, was made to pony up.
So what do we do with all these corporations that basically started here are now worldwide, international places that are conducting their own policies and have their own motives for things? It's it's very uncertain.
You're getting above my job description.
Okay, I will.
When I'm Secretary of State, I'll have an answer for you. But I think it's a very fair question. Yeah. And what's very worrisome, I think, is the way this policy is tumbling out now in the Middle East. And we don't have at least an expressed or understood overarching plan and outcome that we're trying to bring about here.
So what's the future? What's going to happen, do you think, with Indian Point?
I think it's going to be very hard for Indian Point over time to meet the tests that the governor has articulated, first as Attorney General, now as governor, and the new Attorney General in New York has as well. And I think that the tolerance on the part of people for living with the risk is probably way reduced. Whether there's a relicensing in 2013, I think that's the forum. We shouldn't prejudice that outcome. We have lived successfully with this thing for many, many years. But that's a very ripe question.
How much energy do they supply, do you know, to the city, for instance, or the state?
It's somewhere in
About
the 30
third?
percentile
Yeah, about a
range to
third.
the Con Ed service territory.
Right. So then what do we do? How do we supplement that?
Well, there have been offsets already developed. There's a controversy now about something called the Hudson Transmission Project, which would bring power from New Jersey. That's interesting too, because it's power from New Jersey, it's a wire coming to New York, but then people say, well, are they building a new coal plant somewhere out there to come here? So you have these interstate questions that are not just the economics and the availability, but also the environmental impacts of sort of displaced environmental.
And then finally, because we're really coming to the end, the impact, if people understood the impact of everything that they use electricity for, do you think they'd conserve more?
I've come to realize over the course of my career that it's
Or
all
gas,
about
not only
it's
electricity,
about
but
human
gas.
it's about human behavior.
Yeah.
And we choose as a people to be uninformed about a lot of things. And as long as the energy's there, I think we're content to use it.
Yeah.
And we'll pay more. I would never have imagined $4 a gallon gasoline without a revolution in the streets. People are paying it right now in a depressed economy with relatively little complaint. That's astonishing to me, but what do I know?
Well, I think you know a lot, and thank you very much for coming.
It's
And
always good to see
I
you.
hope we'll talk again.
Good to see you, Ron.
Thank you. If there are any people you'd like to hear and topics you'd like us to explore, please let me know. You can write to me at CUNY TV, 365 Fifth Avenue, New York, New York, 10016, or you can go to the website at cuny.tv and click on Contact Us. I look forward to hearing from you.